Welcome to Veteran Resource Podcast, where you will meet nonprofit organizations focused on improving the lives of veterans and their family members. Here is your host, Jeremy Paris.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 15 of the Veteran Resource Podcast. We've got a great episode this week with Wyly Gray from Soldier Encore. I met Wyly first through the Telling Project when he spent only a week preparing for the Telling Project that was performed at the Library of Congress, and him and the other cast members performed it flawlessly. So it was just an amazing show. After that, I was working with The Mission Continues, and I ran into him again, and we started chatting. And just recently, in a past episode with Jonathan from the Telling Project, I found out that Wyly had his own organization called Soldier Encore, and Jonathan wanted me to try to get him on a future episode, and here it is. Before we get into that, though, I'm going to read a few more of the reviews that I got in. We've got the entrepreneur on fire himself, John Lee Dumas, who says, "Us vets need resources, and this show provides them in abundance." And Erica from Beauty in the Vlog says, "Great resource. This is a must listen to any veteran or family member of a veteran. This guy knows his stuff." Giselle Oliveira says, "Love it. Great show for veterans. Keep up the good work." Thank you so much for all of these great reviews. And if you have not reviewed yet, I invite you to go over to iTunes. You can get there by going to veteranpodcast.com/iTunes and just leave a review, and I'll be reading it on a future episode of this podcast. Wyly is originally from Kansas City, Missouri. He had a challenging upbringing. One of the many things that inspired him to join the military was the opportunity to better himself through service. What he didn't anticipate following him from then on, however, was a need to continue serving. Wyly spent over 8 years active duty in the Marine Corps. During his service, he functioned as a Marine Corps security guard, an artillery ammunition chief, and earned the rank of staff sergeant. He deployed twice, first on the maiden voyage of the USS Iwo Jima in 2003, and then again to Helmand Valley Province, Afghanistan in 2008. During his time as an active duty Marine, Wyly traveled to more than 30 countries spanning 5 continents. After his discharge from the Marine Corps, Wyly felt like something was missing. He spent 6 months as an embassy security contractor in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and followed that with 6 months teaching English in a small city in the Vojvodina region of Serbia. He returned to the United States to pursue his education and was accepted into Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. to finish his degree. Despite being a student at his dream school, Wyly was discouraged with his transition to civilian life and found himself struggling with the day-to-day routine of just trying to pay the mortgage, and he longed for something more. He decided to leverage his talents for veteran advocacy. This led to the creation of Soldier Encore. All right, let's jump right into the interview with Wyly. Wyly, welcome to the Veteran Resource Podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Okay, I wanted to get into a little bit about you, but first I want to find out more about just kind of a brief summary of what Soldier Encore is.
Well, Soldier Encore is a veteran service organization that's dedicated to preserving and sharing veterans' stories of service, sacrifice, and transition. So in a nutshell, what that means is I'm looking to archive any veteran story that I can get a hold of to create a much larger database which connects veterans, their stories, and hopefully a monetary outlet for them to actually generate some revenue based on the strength of their submissions.
Oh, very cool, very cool. Okay, I want to dig in a little bit more about that in a bit, but first, let's find out a little bit more about you. Tell me about growing up prior to going in the military. What was that like?
Well, a pretty atypical life, to be honest. I started out pretty rough. I was in foster care from the age of 10 till about 13. My family was split up and tossed around due to several factors, including drug abuse and prostitution and just a really unfortunate set of circumstances. So I became a ward of the state with my two brothers. My younger brother and I were adopted when I was 13 years old, and our entire lifestyle sort of changed. But being a 13-year-old and being in this family, like, there wasn't a lot of plans for me as far as college or even really what it meant to have a teenager. So in a lot of ways, I lacked not just discipline, but I really lacked any sort of guiding force to what I wanted to do or who I wanted to be. I was really fortunate to have an older friend that was an enlisted Marine, and he came back from boot camp, and I just thought he was just the coolest guy I'd ever seen. So when I was 17 and took the ASVAB, and you saw the story I presented, it's a little bit more comical in length, but I became a Marine, and that was the family I never really had in a lot of ways. And I spent 8.5 years active duty, 2 deployments, one for in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then the second one actually to Afghanistan. Towards the end of my career, I got out as a staff sergeant. My last real few months on active duty were spent in Afghanistan before a real hasty return home at late 2008. So when I came back, I initially thought that I was going to do some contracting work, which I did at the embassy in Bosnia. And then after about 6 months of that, I realized that's not what I wanted to do. So I taught English in a small village in northern Vojvodina in Serbia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was an amazing time. And then I sort of realized that, there's that part of me that, wants to talk to people about things. I came back, I got into Georgetown, which was just this dream come true for me. But at the same time, I have this massive empathy fatigue. I've learned the word is now. At the time, I had no idea, but, my marriage fell apart, and I'm spiraling. I'm in this even though I'm in this amazing school, my whole life is sort of unraveling from the inside out, and I've lost my sense of identity. Life gets pretty dark for me for a while, and with absolutely no sense of, pride, I found myself, looking at the wrong end of a gun and thinking that's an option.
Wow.
But a couple months after having that sort of transitionary moment, I was introduced to Jonathan, and he said, do you want to tell your story? And at this point, I thought, I don't got anything to lose. I'm not going to be here. What's it going to hurt if I, say the things that are really, sitting on my heart?
Right.
And I didn't expect anyone to listen, to be absolutely honest. We'd grown up with a whole generation of the Vietnam narrative, which wasn't exactly welcoming. But our generation had it a little bit different. I think people really do want to help veterans in today's day and age. I think that a lot of people question how. And that's a real important part of that transition journey. So again, I'm at this bad spot. I meet Jonathan. I tell my story. I get it as a part of the national record. And that was the real moment for me where I noticed, I have a real responsibility to do this, because if I can do this, if I can face my fear and walk up and, despite the jitters, despite the anxiety, the sometimes overwhelming anxiety, if I can get up here and talk about this and make that a subject that another person that's possibly also suffering from these very same things can talk about and can become accessible on a personal level, it could be a very transformative experience for both parties.
Absolutely. And I just want to back up for a second for the listeners who haven't put it together yet from the episode a couple of weeks ago with Jonathan Way of the Telling Project. What you're referring to is you were in the Telling Project when it came to Washington, D.C., and this was more specifically at the Library of Congress. And so I had this down as one of the points that I really kind of wanted to dig into, because this was the first time that I had met you and the first time that I had learned anything about you. And I was pretty blown away by the whole performance.
It's interesting how you put that, because I think that was the first time that I really met me since coming home. I had always had this narrative. I'd always had this, when I'd come home on leave, my friends would say, this is my friend, the Marine. And when that wasn't a part of my identity anymore, it was weird. It was almost like I felt very coarse and stripped away. In that sense, very, very vulnerable. And looking around again, this is the post 9/11 veteran is one of the most isolated veterans in history, and that's not just a perception. That's statistically accurate. Like if you look at World War II, we had about 12 million people serving out of 140 million. So like 8.7% of the population was directly in the war. The greatest generation. So like 8.7% of them. That's a big portion. That's almost 1 in 10. Like you go to Korea, 1953. 5,720,000 out of 160 million. Again, going down, but still almost 3.5% of the population. Vietnam, 4.5% of the population. And then after Vietnam is the huge dip. Gulf War, 0.8%. Post 9/11, 0.8% of the population have served. And that's just, to me, mind-blowing. I think there's a huge disconnect in our day and age on what it means to serve and what our service means to those who actually performed it. I think that just like the Vietnam generation, there's a real question in the veteran community of why was I there and what did we accomplish, if anything. And to come back home and to not know whether your service was honorable, so to speak, is a pretty big question. And I think veterans are responding to that and the lack of adequate resources to the tune of 22 suicides a day. And that's simply got to stop. And Soldier On Corps is a backbone to share that and save that narrative so that we can start coming home. In a nutshell, that's what it is. It's a way to save our guys by saving their stories.
And that's one of the things that I saw when I was looking at something that you wrote online. The quote says, "We save stories because stories save us."
Yep.
That kind of hit home when I saw that. And yeah, it really does make sense.
It's something that I feel very strongly about. Coming back and having that transformative experience at the Library of Congress, that was a really interesting moment. But following that, I came back to my real life again, and I just had this urge I've got to capture this moment again. I got to know what was it there that I needed to talk about.
I'm sorry to cut you off there, but when you were giving your story, because you said before you gave your story at the Telling Project, you really didn't feel like anybody wanted to hear or anybody cared about your story. But then after actually performing it, I imagine that changed for you.
Yeah, absolutely did. That's kind of the thing. I felt instead of it just being like, this is something I could do and, whether I'm here or not doesn't really matter, it turned into like, you have an obligation to do this. But even that kind of was lacking, to be honest. I still felt like something was missing, and it took another 1.5 or 2 years of personal maturation through working with other organizations such as the Mission Continues and further incubation with the Telling Project to sort of develop the specific skill set needed to really pull off Soldier On Corps and to make it the bastion of an archive that I hope for it to be.
Right. And that was the second time that I ran into you, actually, was with the Mission Continues. And I was there, as I've talked about before, helping with the Veteran Artist Program to bring mural artists to help revitalize the school. And you had a ton of people doing amazing things that day. So the first time that I met you, I was blown away by your performance. I mean, comparing what I did with the Telling Project, I took 6 months to kind of create my story and learn it and memorize it and then act it out on stage. You guys did it in a week. And it was amazing. So the first time I met you...
Thank you so much.
I mean, I was blown away by your performance. And, I mean, a week, really.
Yeah, I was, I was under the impression that at the time, Jonathan Way, the director of the Telling Project, made it seem as though this was sort of business as usual. Like, we do all of these in a week. And I found out later that was the first trial run of that concept model. So it worked. I was incredibly pleased with the performance. And when it's a time of stress for me, I sort of black out those moments. So I don't even really remember the performance itself. I had to watch it a second time to see how I'd done. But,
yeah, well, from my seats, it was, and I was in the front row, by the way, outstanding. And then the second time with the Mission Continues, it's just like blown away again by watching what you were doing there. You just seem to be, that is what I know you to be.
Yeah, the mission continues. Again, very fortunate to be there. Probably the darkest portion of my transition journey was right before connecting with them as well. So I had just sort of, talked about how transformative that moment was on stage. But then again, coming back to my life and being underwhelmed by my day-to-day and finding it hard to even really get out of bed and to face, my very regulated day. Despite that experience is kind of where the mission continues came in. I got offered a fellowship to come out to LA, and there was going to be this 3-day weekend where they were going to induct us all into the fellowship, and then I would spend 6 months doing community service with a nonprofit here in the DC area that did something that I believed in. So I go out there, and again I have the same sort of mentality, like, well, you're not going to hang around forever, you might as well do some good with while you're here. And I have this uncanny ability of finding myself surrounded by amazing people. And I don't know what it is, but I just feel very fortunate to always find myself surrounded by just the most amazing human beings. And one of those was Lieutenant Colonel Mark Weber, who recently passed of stage 4 cancer. But, I'm looking at this guy, and he's literally, I didn't know it at the time, but, he's literally dying of cancer, and he's got a smile on his face, and he's challenging me to, do my work better and to do it harder and to have more intensity. And I find out that, that he's dying, and I corner him, and I'm like, Mark, you got to be kidding me. You're not even supposed to have a couple months left. There's no way you're going to finish this fellowship. What are you doing here? Why aren't you spending your time with your family? You have 2 beautiful sons and a wife. And I'm shocked that would even for a second think of sacrificing that time. And he looked at me and he says, none of us choose when we die, but I choose how I live every moment. And I choose to smile, and I choose to challenge myself, and I choose to be a beacon for other people. And
Wow.
That was a moment for me where I had to really reassess who I was and what was I offering the world. Not what things have been so tough. Look at this hand I was given. Instead of that, no, what have you done with what you've been given, and how have you made a positive impact for others? And I think that that's a really important life lesson. I'm sorry that it took me so long to figure it out, to be absolutely honest. But I joined the Marines. I wasn't always the smartest guy around.
Well, obviously what he set out to do in setting a fire in others, he did that in you.
Absolutely.
And you've continued on in the fact that you're mentioning him now and talking about the impact that he had on you. I mean, he did exactly what he was setting out to do.
Again, I can't stress enough how fortunate I've been to be surrounded by simply amazing people. And life is a really interesting place, and we all have choices, and we all have to deal with the repercussions of those choices. But to constantly and consistently be able to say that I've been surrounded by a support structure that not only wouldn't let me fail, but strove to build me up, has been just a real blessing in my life. And I feel I can't even imagine the person I was coming home now. It's a very strange thing.
Well, what's that saying that you always hear? You're the equivalent of the 5 people you spend the most amount of time with?
Yeah, exactly.
Surround yourself with amazing people, and you'll be amazing.
I've been very lucky. That's the most I can say about that. It's been a very humbling experience to see people that seem to have no off switch. The Mission Continues founder, Eric Greitens, he's a Navy SEAL, a Golden Gloves winner, an Oxford scholar. This guy, he's superhuman. And you meet him in real life, and he's down to earth, and he's there aren't a lot of amazing role models out there, but man, when you get one, you just got to hold on for as long as you can and try to get as much information and, try to formulate as much as you can based on those experiences. But even having a moment is just fortunate. And I've been pretty lucky.
And then eventually you become one.
One can hope. That's ultimately if something that I'm able to do or say helps another person, look at their own trajectory and change it just 1 degree, I would argue, just as Eric Greitens argued, by the time you get to the end of your journey, you'll find that 1 degree change really changed everything.
Absolutely. And so I want to talk more about Soldier Encore now. How did that idea come about?
So That sprung up basically through my internship and through that fellowship. I've always been pretty technologically inclined. My second year of college actually was pursuing a computing and engineering degree before I wised up and decided I didn't want to live in a cubicle forever. But I'm watching these other amazing young entrepreneurs at the International Center for Journalists here in DC put together projects that have international impact. Like one of the fellows for the Knight Foundation, his name is Gustavo Falieros, and he created this idea called Info Amazonia. And what it is a website that tracks in real time the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. And it's this amazing, like, very human-centered, because most of the data points are actually either text messaged in or sent in from people on the ground. Like, it really incorporates the community with something that's very relevant to their needs, which is that deforestation. And that idea, and then seeing how young he was, and thinking to myself, like, you know, all you need is really one good idea, and if it has merit, if it has legs, it'll run, you know?
Right.
And that idea for me was, we have this amazing, you know, more than 3.5 million veterans that are, if Georgetown has taught me anything, they're first-person accounts of war, of what these wars meant and where these people went. So what Soldier Encore does is it takes these stories and it puts them into a framework where we can sort of tease information out of the inputs that we're given. So, for example, if we got a story from the Vietnam era from an American in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, we'll input his name, create a file, and that file now will be connected not just to his hometown, not just to the community that he left and supported, but also to where his service took him. And that'll create unique data points along the map. And what you find is, especially when you overlay things like the casualties in war and any of the other filters that'll be available, you create a very real weather map of war, if you will. You've seen the Doppler radar and how the weather moves across the map. You'll be able to see how casualties move across a battle space, or how units effectively and tactically are positioned and were positioned in times of war from first-person narratives. And I think that has a tremendous amount of application in a ton of different areas, and not just necessarily centric to the veteran community, but overall as a function of an archiving aspect for the national narrative and what it means to be in America in our era, and what service means in this era as well.
And that database will be available to just anybody?
Absolutely. The idea of it at this juncture, unless there's any sort of a security concern or an operational security concern for that matter, it'll be absolutely open source. But if something comes out that, you know, I've got to censor, I'm going to have to censor it. That's the reality of it.
Right.
You don't want to endanger American lives. That's obviously another priority. It would be, you know, anathema to what I'm trying to create to have somebody be endangered due to its creation. But if it's not something that, you know, falls into those realms, then it's absolutely open source.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I was looking at as a possible scenario, having a very small film background, but one that I would like to develop over the years in my, you know, tons of free time, would be going through the database and pulling out the different stories and kind of piecing them together along the timeline in order to a script, if you will, of actual accounts of things that have happened, and using that for a story plot that you can build a film around.
So there's going to be 3 separate ways to access information on the main webpage at soldierencore.org. And the way that that's going to be is firstly an aggregate of popularity, like whichever stories have fared the best, you'll have a direct link to be able to look at those stories. And again, as I said earlier, a direct way to either purchase bundles of those stories along with other digital content, or directly contribute to the veteran that submitted to it. And then the second part of that you'll be able to access content based on that map, as I said, that you'll be able to see where the stories are located based on hovering your cursor over the map. You could click on, for example, an area, say Afghanistan, and then see all the nested stories that are in Afghanistan based on not just the time they happened, as you said, which brings up our third way of accessing information, but also the location they happened. So you could actually tease that information 2 separate ways. You could also get a concurrent storyline from Iraq and Afghanistan at the same moment in time, for example.
Interesting. And I could see the use case of adding more filters as time goes on somebody says, hey, well, what about this idea or what about that idea? And you can always just add to the schema of the database.
Absolutely. And that's ultimately what it is going to be a very, very large database with information that you'll be able to manipulate in a way that hopefully is meaningful to you, the user, and you, the veteran, specifically.
Very cool. And what is the time frame that you're looking at for having the database all set up and ready to go?
Well, I'm tentatively pushing that towards 9 months. So by spring of next year, I'd like to have this database created. And we're actively looking for developers that have JavaScript experience. So if you have that availability and you want to email info@soldieroncore.org with your CV, I'd greatly appreciate it. But we have the backdrop built. We've got the fundamentals of the database in construction, but a couple more technical aspects to pull it off. And then it'll just be growing it simply by story submission. And that's going to be the fun part, I think. I think, as the stories start to really come in, I mean, right now we've probably got, say, 100 interviews at this point, but actually having 100 profiles that are set up in the database that actually reflects the information as I presented it to you will be just amazing. And I can't wait to get that there, because that tool is what I was looking for when I got out in 2008. Something that sort of connected me again to what it meant to serve. Like, why was I there, and what was I a part of? And I think that, at least in very raw terms, that really does answer the question.
Right. Very cool. And this is just a side note here. It's funny because I had this rough idea, this rough outline of the path that the story was going to go. And we've jumped back and forth so many times.
Yeah, I'm sure that this is going to be heck in the editing room. As my interviews, I'm sure, usually are.
I've had worse.
As someone that does interviews, I can only say I absolutely feel your pain.
Are you doing your interviews over Skype as well?
Yeah, exact same layout. Yeah. And then I use those raw transcriptions to actually build the data points. And that's actually one of the cool parts about working. Again, I'm working with the Telling Project again for my initiative, and that's fantastic because it gives me access to a bevy of already created stories. So having some of the data points already sort of starting to flesh themselves out really gives it more of a shape in my mind, so that I can lay that out on paper for a developer, and that's critical. Being able to actually talk about it and to get that onto into a usable format is half the problem with developing, I think.
Right, and as my experience was with the Telling Project, there's going to be so many more stories that you're going to be able to get by going and having access to the Telling Project, because for me, I was one of those people that was convinced I didn't have a story until I told it. So you're going to find a lot more stories out there than people were willing to give before.
Yeah,
so I'm loving what they're doing.
I think that when people realize, especially when the veteran community realizes that, Soldier Encore isn't using your stories, just to make a buck or something along those lines. Like, it really is an initiative that wants to save and preserve these stories for posterity, not just distribute them. But as a side note to that, we do want to distribute your stories, and at the same time, we want to give you a piece of that, because your trials and tribulations shouldn't be entertainment unless you choose for them to be. And if you do, and if you choose to be a part of this, it's gonna be an interesting ride. And I'm really looking forward to talking to some awesome veterans that hear about it and are able to share with the veteran community how they've come home and what that's meant to them and what they did when they served.
Do you anticipate a lot of reporters using the service?
I anticipate that as the database becomes more and more filled with data points, that it's going to become more useful to a larger subset of people, especially reporters, for sure. And I think a big portion of what I'm trying to do, though, it changes that model a bit, because we're actively crafting our story now. Too long has the veteran been a pawn of politicians and a side note in these political debates, and not an active component of the legislation process, or an active component of actually dictating their own narrative. So in that very real vein, I think that if we don't command our story as a veteran community, and I aim to do that with Soldier Encore, if we don't do that, someone else will. And they'll do it for profit 9 times out of 10.
All right, Wyly, we are just about ready to get into the final 3 questions. But before we do, I just wanted to see if there was anything else about Soldier Encore that we didn't cover yet.
There is one part. One of the pieces of Soldier Encore, we talked a lot about saving that narrative of the veterans that, maybe hear this podcast or find out about us through other means. But the other arm that Soldier Encore is very passionate about is telling the stories of those service members that have died. So the 6,840 service members that haven't come home from Iraq and Afghanistan, those family members, where we can, we've started reaching out to them as well to begin getting their interviews and to build, instead of just a statistical backdrop of the sacrifice that their loved one performed for their country, but instead of just getting that, also getting the story of who this person was and what motivated them to be who they were and what that person meant to the people around them that they left behind. And that is a fundamental part of Soldier Encore as well, is the idea that we're not leaving anybody behind, and where we can, we're going to save that story. And everyone, whether you're a veteran or a civilian, everyone has a story. And the worst thing in the world is to be forgotten, and to go out and do your nation's bidding and to come back and be a number instead of a face, I think is a very huge tragedy in our day and age. And I aim to rectify it directly. And
you mentioned that you were looking for JavaScript developers. Is there anything else, anything else that you were looking, or any other help that you were looking for between now and the time that the database is ready to go?
Absolutely looking for investors. If you have, if you have any sort of an eye or a mind for, potential revenue streams, and you think that there's value in this idea, please reach out to me at info@soldierencore.org, and I'm happy to talk to you. Nothing is free, and this is really a labor of love. At this point, we are actively seeking grant funding and other revenue streams, but you can directly help out and be a part of this in real time and help us save the narrative of our generation's returning veterans.
Great. Okay, Wyly, I think we're ready for the final 3.
Let's do it.
You ready?
I think I am.
Excellent. Okay, question number 1. Who would you like to hear on a future episode of Veteran Resource Podcast?
I would like to hear Jennifer Hassan on a future episode, and she is a returning veteran, also a Mission Continues fellowship alumna, and she has her own art studio called Jen Hassan Studios with an initiative called Wings of Courage, which aims to help tell the story in an artistic medium of military sexual trauma. And having, being a male in the military, that's something I didn't really see directly, serving mainly in all-male units for a lot of the time that I was in the Marines. But at the same time, having worked with veterans outside now, military sexual trauma is a topic that we need to address and that we need to create safe places to talk about. And I think that she does an amazing job of doing that.
That sounds great. I will definitely reach out to Jennifer. Okay, question number 2. What upcoming project has you fired up right now?
Building this database. I am so excited to see how you can tease the data. I mean, ultimately, just the idea of being able to see, if you input simply the casualties for Iraq and Afghanistan on the map of Iraq and Afghanistan, you get very quickly an idea of how the war moved, at least through our casualties in that war during that time frame. And being able to do that not just for those wars, but for wars going back as far as we have submissions, I think is going to be incredibly interesting and hopefully really informative.
I think so. All right, the last question. This one is the brain stretcher. If you woke up tomorrow and you found out that somebody made an anonymous donation of $10 million to your organization, what would you do with it?
I would immediately hire a team of the smartest people I could find to help me put together a strategy for $10 million and my organization. Because again, I've had the fortune of being surrounded by amazing people, and that's a big question. I think I would definitely reach out to friends and family to and professional contacts to find the best answer. But I think the short end of the stick is it would go into making Soldier Encore not just an amazing tool, but a tool that lasts in perpetuity.
Excellent. Okay, and for that person with the $10 million, or for anybody else that wants to get in contact with you or your organization, what's the best way?
You can email me at wyly@soldierencore.org, or if you have general concerns, info@soldierencore.org. If you'd like to donate, please visit thetellingproject.org, click on their donate button, and mark it care of Soldier On. I appreciate all the support. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you having me on, Jeremy. This is an amazing initiative that you've created, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of organizations out there, and a lot of different ones that most veterans are just now finding out about or don't know about and never would be finding out about if it wasn't for, trying to get where they are. And I noticed that people were starting to gravitate towards podcasts, and so I jumped in. I filled the gap. When
something's needed, it finds a way of being created, and that is ultimately the story of Soldier Encore in a nutshell. I again want to thank you for having me on, and any veteran out there that wants to tell your story, simply reach out to me, wyly@soldierencore.org, and let's talk. I'm happy to save it.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Wyly, for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, that closes out this interview with Wyly Gray. What do you think about that database that Wyly's building? Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? If you have some skills or anything else that you think could help him out and you wanted to get in contact with him, make sure you hit the show notes at veteranpodcast.com/015, and I'll make sure to put all of the links to his organization and to him in the show notes. And thanks again for tuning in and listening. If you know of any other veterans that you think would be interested in listening to this podcast, make sure you point them to veteranpodcast.com. And if you wanted to reach out to me, Jeremy@veteranpodcast.com, or you could hit me up on Twitter. I always love getting tweets. ParisJ13 on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in episode 16.